Well, this is the agenda I want us to follow today. We'll have a brief description of a security term called the principle of least privilege. I'm sure that those of you who are security professionals can possibly come up with better definitions of the principle of least privilege than I'll give you, but we'll talk about it at least so that the DBAs among us will know what we're talking about. Then we'll go through how implementing the principle of least privilege in an Oracle database used to be done in earlier releases. Following which, we'll look at privilege analysis, because privilege analysis is the new capability for working out just what on earth it is that schemas or users, doesn't have to be schemas, could be application users, can do within your database. A wonderful enhancement that came in later releases of the database. And of course, we'll go through demonstrations, simple demonstrations, of showing how to use privilege analysis and what it can actually do for you. Moving on from there, POLP. As I said, those of you who are security professionals will, if you have a better definition than the ones I'm going to give you, by all means, please chat them in. I'll be going to pleased to discuss it. But it is a standard term that I see coming up again and again in the security world. This is Oracle's definition. This is from the Oracle docs. So security principles, we have separation of duties and the principle of least privilege. A not very helpful statement here. Principle of least privilege and separation of duties are concepts that, though semantically different, are intrinsically related. Great. Well, here's a bit of a definition. The intent behind both is to prevent people from having higher privileges than they actually need. That's the general idea. Or to use my somewhat cruder definition, users should have the privilege they need, no less and no more. Clearly no less, because if they don't have the required privileges, they can't do their jobs. But also, no more. We need some way of restricting people so that they can do nothing that they don't need to do. That's the general concept we want to get towards. Need to know is another term you see used many times. If you Google what is the difference between principle of least privilege and need to know, you'll find all sorts of definitions, sometimes not particularly helpful in my opinion, that try to tell them to separate them. But the general idea, users should have what they need and no more. What does that mean in the Oracle environment? You restrict your privilege and role grants to the minimum. Now, some people will tell you that I've heard people say, in an Oracle database, everything not explicitly permitted is forbidden. Well, it isn't quite like that. Once a session is logged on, it will in fact have access to many thousands of public grants, many objects that are publicly available, programmatic objects, as well as data containing objects. These are all the preceded objects provided in any Oracle database. User-defined objects really should be better protected. And your user-defined objects, you protect with discretionary access control. Discretionary access control, that means object privileges, system privileges. And the general idea is you want to make sure that the code people are running, whether it's SQL, issued ad hoc, or stored PL SQL procedures, whatever the code is, it should run with the lowest permissions possible. The permissions it needs to run to do its job, and nothing else. A classic case here would be SQL injection. If you have badly written PL SQL, maybe a web application that's badly designed in the PL SQL, and it lets people inject SQL into the database the developer never expected to be run. What privileges is it going to run with? It's going to run by default with the privileges of the code's owner, for instance. So discretionary access control is part of the solution, but you have to consider programmatic techniques as well. That acronym, CBAC, code-based access control, that's a capability that came in release 12, and that can help secure your systems hugely. The general idea, though, consider applications such as Apex. In an Apex environment, all Apex sessions connect as a low-privileged public user, but then those sessions proxy to the Apex workspace's parsing schema, and that gives them access to everything in that schema. The only protection you have in an Apex environment is how well your programmers wrote that Apex code. In eBusiness Suite, take another example from the real world. I'm sure many of you run eBusiness Suite. With eBiz, all sessions connect to the app schema, and the app schema has total power in the eBiz database. It's got grants that give it complete privileges on all the data in the eBiz database, and of course, apps owns all the programmatic objects. So within eBiz, you are totally dependent on Oracle's developers for restricting what the application users can actually do, because the database will not be restricting what they can do at all. So code-based access programmatic techniques, your developers need to control what people can do. Code-based access control may well be a very good solution where you grant privileges to individual code blocks, and that can really tighten things up. We have a tutorial on this somewhere. Oh, thank you, Dave. I see that's in the chat. We have a tutorial on code-based access control, which may be of value, but I don't want to get too much into talking about that right now. So all that having been said, limiting or implementing the principle of least privilege by limiting object and system privileges is essential. It isn't enough, but it is essential. And your security auditors are going to demand that you as DBAs can demonstrate that you've implemented discretionary access control, your grants of object and system privileges and role privileges, of course, that you've implemented that correctly to implement, as far as can be done, the principle of least privilege.
John, question for me. I've seen thousands of execute Java classes, supply Java classes. What are those? There's public grants. Can you tell me a little bit about those?
It's quite terrifying, isn't it? If you were, let us just run a simple demonstration. Now, if you run a simple query such as this, select type, privilege, count staff, and DBA tab privs, where grant equals public. This is terrifying. On the face of it, anyone with any sort of log onto the database can read 78 tables. If any of you aren't familiar with read, by the way, that's a fairly recent privilege. Select includes the ability to select for update, which means read-only users can in fact lock tables. Read doesn't let you do that lock. That's just a by the by. We have execute, 36,000 Java classes. Yeah, that's the really frightening one. And some of those Java classes will allow people to do quite dangerous things within the database. So anyone has access to all of these capabilities. That is just where public has the grant. The procedures are perhaps the most worrying, as that includes, out of the box, certain procedures, the UTL procedures, UTL TCP, UTL mail, UTL HTTP. So in principle, anyone with any sort of logon can run all the TCP code, for example. It's pretty risky stuff. Okay.
John, did you say read privilege has an impact on locks?
It's select that has the impact on locks. If you're going to grant people select on a table, they are then implicitly granted the ability to select for update. So select actually lets you lock tables. I can select star from so-and-so for update and lock the table. And in later releases, I think it was release 12 when read came in. As a general rule, you don't want to grant select on a table. You want to grant read on a table. It's much safer. It prevents people from locking it.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, privilege analysis was introduced in 12c release 1. And I saw it and I thought, this is a godsend. The first time I started experimenting with it in the betas of 12c release 1. And I realized at last I can work out just what people can do in the database, what they can do and what they can't do. It was a wonderful capability. But when 12c release 1 went GA, generally available, and all the docs are published, I looked at the licensing doc. And there was the bad news. This fantastic capability was in fact part of Data Vault. And that meant it's licensed. And I think a lot of sites do license Data Vault, but by no means all of them. So in 12c release 1, it was a bit of disappointment. Privilege analysis was there, but the majority of sites couldn't use it. That changed in release 18, also known as 12.2.12202. But in release 18c, they de-licensed privilege analysis and put it into Enterprise Edition. I have to say that if I understood licensing, I would be a salesman and rich instead of a technician and poor. But this was quite an important change. There's an 18c, you can now use privilege analysis. It got better when 19c came out. Remember, 19c is your long-term support release of what they call the 12c database family, release family. And from 19c, privilege analysis is available in any Enterprise Edition database, going right back to 12c R1. So from the date of 19c release, you've got access to privilege analysis. If you are on Enterprise Edition. And this, of course, is the bad news. Those of us running with SE2 licenses, we do not have access to privilege analysis. If you still have 11G, well, I hope it's 11.204, but if you still have 11G databases, then they have not backported privilege analysis to 11G. So that's the bad news. But for those of you with Enterprise Edition, privilege analysis is there. You almost certainly want to start using it.
John, I know you're going to get to it. I don't know if it's in the second segment where you're going to do your demonstrations, but I'll ask a silly question perhaps. How do I do privilege analysis? Is there an easy way? I mean, I've written horrible scripts, right? to tell me who's got what privileges, but.
That is coming up. What do you do if you haven't got privilege analysis? You write the most horrendous scripts. And interesting, you've done it, Dave. I've done it. I'm sure many of you attending this class have done it, this lecture have done it. We know the views, DBA sysprivs, that will tell you DBA sysprivs. That will tell you what system privileges have been granted to which user. This user has this privilege. Then we have DBA tab privs. Remember the misnomer? This dates back, of course, DBA tab privs dates back many releases to before we had proper privilege management. Dates back basically to release 6. In release 6, there was no stored PL SQL. All you had was tables. Well, we now have the rather strange situation that grants of execute on PL SQL procedures are documented into DBA tab privs. So remember, it's called tab privs, table privileges. It's actually object privileges. So that will show you all the grants on data objects, like tables, and programmatic objects, like stored PL SQL procedures. But then it gets worse. You've got roles. When you come to roles, DBA role privs, we might have got, well, this will show you what roles have been granted to whom. But then to work out, you may have been granted a role. What can that role do? You have to write some horrible recursive query that's going to say, this guy has this role, but then this role has these system privileges. And also this role has these object privileges. It's horrible code. And when you go to role privs, because of course we can grant roles to roles, things get even more complicated. Role. Oops, sorry, I've lost my, there we go. Role privs. What roles have been granted to roles? And that's one people often forget because it's out of the normal naming convention of user, all, DBA, and CDB. And maybe they're column level privileges. That's, of course, is the new one. DBA code role privs, that's for code-based access control, the new capability. So writing code to work out what privileges a currently connected session actually has at any given moment, because remember, roles can be enabled and disabled dynamically, is phenomenally difficult. Absolutely awful trying to code that sort of thing, in my opinion. There is, what you have to do is write scripts, dreadful scripts. If you are in the situation of using, as on the previous slide, Standard Edition or 11G, you have to write codes that will navigate these views recursively, going from one to another and back and forth to work out what somebody can do. You don't want to write code like that yourself, believe me. What I will do is point you towards the website of an erstwhile colleague of ours. Oops, sorry, wrong query. And, here we go. And this URL here on the Pete Finnegan website. And Pete has published some very helpful code blocks here. For example, find all privs, a short script to find all privileges granted to a particular user, gives you role, system privileges, and object privileges. And note, he also does the recursive work there. And there are there's some variations as well. I'll just put that URL into the chat. I shall do there. And if you're having to write your own code, you may find some useful hints there. The scripts from Pete's are good, but they're perhaps not completely up to date. And obviously, I don't know what they'll catch everything. You would have to evaluate that for yourselves. So what do you do then if you suspect that users have too high privileges? They can do too much. Well, those scripts you write, such as those from Pete Finnegan, will help. They'll tell you what a user has. They won't tell you what the user needs. They'll tell you the user has these privileges, but maybe he shouldn't have them. And the scripts can't tell you that. So all too often, when you end up, if you have to harden a system, you end up just thinking, does he really need execute on that package? Does he really need that role? I don't know. And all you can do is revoke it and see if the application breaks. Now, I've been in that situation a few times, just revoking privileges, which I think might be a bit risky. And then you have to do loads of testing and see, does the application still work? Very, very difficult to do, very time consuming, and not exactly a scientific approach. You need something better. And what we have that is better is privilege analysis, which we can go through after a short break.
Thanks, John. We're going to take a 30-second break from John, give him a chance to rest. Look, guys, I haven't seen any questions come in, and that's always a little bit of a concern. Want to make sure that what John is teaching us today is resonating with everybody. Usually there's a couple of questions, so if you have them, bring them on in. So look, just a couple of seconds about what John and I and SkillBuilders can provide for you. You might know us as a training company, but keep in mind we can also provide services. For example, database security administration services. So we can do CIS security audits. We do them all the time, or SCAP scans. Of course, privilege analysis, as we're learning here today. If you want us to do it for you, you're short-staffed, got too much on your hands right now, which is a very common situation, let us help. We can also do application security. In addition to John, we've got a developer team, Apex and otherwise. So we can help you write your Apex apps or just review them for security. We also are a reseller of a tool called Apex Sec. Some of you may have heard of Apex Sec. It's a popular and very well regarded tool for analyzing Apex applications for security. Now, we have, for Apex Sec, we have a tutorial on how to use Apex Sec. I put the link to it in our chat, so you can go take a look at that tutorial if you'd like. I forgot to mention the database health check. This is a very popular service today. Now, the health check covers more than security, but a lot of what health check is about is making sure that your database is indeed secure. So you might be interested in a database health check, a very popular service that we provide now. It was also, as part of database hardening or Apex or application security, OS configuration as well is part of what we do. Now, training. A lot of you know us as a training company, and we've been doing that since 1994. The class that you may be interested, that's relevant to what you're learning today, is the Oracle Database Security Administration class. This is taught by John, and I have indeed put the link to that class, the administration class, and John's showing it on our screen now. So the next iteration, it says August. That might change to September. I'm not quite sure if that date is right, but you should try to register for that class. And by the way, I know if you call Gary at the office to register for that class, you can register online, but if you call Gary for a registration, which I would advise you to do, you will get a discount for attending this webinar. So call in and try to get registered for that class. Love to have you. All righty.
He's now got 8 ways of getting to that table. And to stop him from getting to that table, I've got to revoke every one of them. And this is the hellish business of, to go back 2 slides, querying these views to work out just what can a person actually do within the database. Well, let's go for privilege capture. I'm just going to revoke DBA because that will really confuse things. Revoke DBA from JW. That gives so many privileges, it will rather flood, it will tend to flood the privilege analysis output if I left that one enabled. Now, the workflow. First off, you create a capture. Now, the call I'm going to use is this. I'll copy in the call and then work through what's actually happening. So I'm going to execute dbs privilege capture.create capture. Give the capture a name, and the capture then has a type. Remember from the arguments, we have the name, I've skipped over description, and then we have a type of capture. And if it's a role type capture, a list of roles, and optionally a condition as well. What I'm doing is the way I've found to be most useful, and my type of capture is based on context variables. Type dbs privilege capture, G context condition, G context. It's a context variable. And my variable is using the syscontext function to go to the user env context, and I'm picking up session user equals JW. So this capture is going to pick up every privilege used by anyone logged on as JW. Alternatives would be every privilege used or every role used by a certain user, any number of things. Syscontext going to say the user env environment. It doesn't have to be user env. It could be a user-defined context, but that would let me pick up what's being done by, for example, a user, as in this case, an application user based on client identifier, perhaps what privileges are being used by people using a particular tool, such as Toad or whatever, or maybe people coming in from a particular machine. What privileges are being used by people coming in through one named application server. A number of possibilities. I'm just going for client server environment, who's logged on with that schema name. Then you enable the capture. And from now on, if I use the procedure call to enable the capture, from now on, everyone who logs on connected to JW, we will be recording what privileges he used. I'll just go to fresh connection to bring it into effect. Right. Then you run your workload. And that might mean, perhaps it's an application that was written by your developers, and before it goes live, you want to do this check. Well, maybe there's a user acceptance testing period that's running for 3 weeks. You'll let the capture run for 3 weeks to make sure you run the entire workload that's going to hit that your application is going to generate. So you run your workload, and you can leave the capture running for minutes, hours, days, weeks. Well, I'm going to run a much shorter workload than that. I'm going to run select star from scott.dept, select star from scott.emp. In principle, I have no idea how he got to those tables. Right. But all we know is that JW can see them. The application is working. But how is it working? And does he have more privileges than he needs? Okay, next step, disable the capture. So we disable the capture. And just disconnect from here to make sure everything is flushed properly. And disable the capture, which was called JWCap. We then generate the results. dbs privilege capture .generate results. And again, just to remind you of how simple this privilege capture can be. Oops.
Hey John, where does the capture get stored?
It's all in data dictionary tables. So I guess if you were to enable a capture for the entire database and leave it running for a week, I think you could be in trouble. You'd need to be watching your space usage. And, yeah, I think it could be.
Sysawks, John?
I haven't reverse engineered it. It'll be sysawks, or worse still, it could be system. I would hope it's sysawks. I would hope so. Now, what we can do though, we could in fact reverse engineer that and work it out right now, but perhaps not. I'm going to use generate results. So generate results, you give the name of the capture and optionally a run name. When you enable a capture, you might want to enable it, run it for a week, disable it, generate a result. Change a few things, run it again. And you can name the runs. In this case, I've only run JWCap once, so just generating results will be enough. This might take a while if it's a big capture over a substantial period of time. But the end result is that it has populated a whole bunch of views. Right, those views, for example, DBA, and let's see, I think probably, right. So these are the views. You've got DBA unused and DBA used. If you just look at them, they're reasonably self-explanatory. This will tell you for that particular capture which privileges were used, and then what's really difficult to capture in any other way, which privileges do those sessions have that they didn't need, which privileges were not used. And the general idea is that any privileges listed here, well, clearly the application needs them or used them, and you need to work out, did he really need them? And any listed here, you'll be thinking, those are grants he shouldn't have. Right, so let's just run a couple of queries against my capture here. I'm just going to configure my session to format a few columns. So if I select star from DBA used privs, that's my usual starting point, DBA used privs. So right, stretch that a bit further. And try again. Right, this tells me that the capture JWCap had apparently, it used 8 privileges. I only ran it, I logged on and ran 2 queries, didn't I? And that was it. And we see here that this operating system user from this machine using SQL+, logged on as JW. The privilege he used is create session, but that wasn't through a direct grant. He got it through connects. Interesting. You're not meant to use connects anymore. It's officially deprecated. And there you see the grant path. He got it through the connect role. Then there's another one. Through the role R1, he ran select on scott.emp. And there's the grant path. R1 granted to R2, granted to JW. But then more interestingly, we see public could also have got in there. Right. And we see that coming up here. Oh, that's a different one. That's just the logon trigger. We don't need to worry about that. But we also see he's got select any table, and he used that to get to depth. And this makes you think, surely there's a better way of getting to depth. Maybe he needs to get to depth. It doesn't mean he needs select any table. So we can see already quite a lot of useful information. We shouldn't be using that. We should have given him a direct grant. Was it really, is that really the best way to go through? And this, does he really need selecting table, or is there a better way? There's another way. Not only could he get to scott.emp through that route, he could also have got there rather more directly from R1, which indeed is shown there. Now, interpreting these may take a while, but you can see here what privileges he actually used or could have used. It's showing us all the ways that JW had to get to scott.emp. Right, and the system privilege he used to get to scott.dept. But then it gets better. Let us look at the other view that's often most valuable, which is DBA unused privs. Oops. So let's start from DBA unused privs. And now we see some quite interesting information. He didn't actually use read on scott.emp, right, which he got as a direct grant. He didn't use set container, which he acquired through Connect. Interesting. All of these he's got through his grant of the resource role, and he didn't need them either. So there's loads of stuff he's got that he doesn't need, including some things that, and this is where he's got some JSON privileges. These are the default grants, of course. The simple, the simple Oracle data access, or download managing documents and so on, the SODA stuff. So these are all the things that we can safely revoke without breaking the application. Right. So this result is giving us the information we need to know what we can safely revoke without breaking things. In this case, we know what he needs. He needs to be able to get to scott.emp and scott.dept. That's what he needs. That's the only actual objects he got to. That's what he needs to get to. But he had numerous ways of getting there. And he's also got all this stuff that, according to the principle of least privilege, he really shouldn't have. So this tells us what we need to do. We could, in fact, revoke everything, except we could revoke everything, grant him create session directly, grant him R1, if we then include select from scott.dept in a grant to R1. And then we tightened up our system. We revoke everything, we grant him create session, we grant select on scott.emp to R1, and then we grant R1 to JW. And that will be the principle of least privilege. He'll be able to do exactly what he needs to do and not one thing more. So what I would do is this. I'll copy paste what I would do in here. Oops. Copy and paste. Revoke that direct grant, object grant. Revoke that object grant. Revoke the public grant. Revoke R2. Revoke connects. Revoke resource. And then give him grant on scott.dept to R1, and he's still got R1 granted to J1 to JW. And that tightens up the system. I would then run the capture again. I'm not going to do this because we're coming to the end of our time. I'd run the capture again, run the workload again, and we should then see exactly what we want. That he had used the privileges he had acquired through R1 plus create session and had no privileges that had not been used. So that's your workflow. It's iterative, of course. And when you're finally finished, we can just drop the capture. And the point at which you drop the capture, the views get cleared. So that's your workflow. And comparing that to writing code to query the views, no matter what code you write, it's not going to tell you what he has that he doesn't need. It is wonderful. So to conclude, the principle of least privilege is a really nice idea, but in an Oracle database, it's really difficult to work out what people can actually do. And it's even harder for the DBA to work out what they really need. And that's where privilege analysis is a wonderful capability.